Chapter 1. The Lease on Orion Street. The first thing I noticed about the new roommate wasn't the silver of her hair or the faint bioluminescent pulse that moved like a heartbeat under the skin of her temples when she breathed in earth air too quickly. It was the way she stood in the threshold of the apartment, as though the door was a border that might not let her back if she crossed. I had put the listing up on the university's housing board: 1 bedroom, shared kitchen, utilities split, no smoking, and the replies had been the usual mix of bots, scammers, and students desperate enough to promise their future selves wages. Then came the short message from someone named Eric's of Houseville. I am new to your world and wish to learn how you live. I will be quiet and clean, and I will pay rent on time. There had been 10 attachments: proof of sponsorship, exchange visa, transcripts, a letter from a research fellowship, and a medical clearance that my doctor friend later told me was the kind of thing diplomats carried. Every checkbox a promise to a foreign planet. When she arrived, Orion Street was washed by the late sun in the way it only was in the shoulder seasons, light like honey caught in smog. She looked up at the faded brick, at the tangle of telephone wires, and then at me, a human in a wrinkled t-shirt bearing the sigil of a band I'd loved too long. "Hello," she said carefully, the syllables balanced like stones across a stream. "I am home." I carried her single suitcase composite fiber, humming faintly, and she followed, feet in soft boots that adjusted pressure with a whisper. The apartment was not much. A hallway that smelled vaguely of cumin from the neighbor's stove, 2 rooms painted in the cheapest white, and windows that rattled when the wind turned sharp. But I had put fresh sheets on the spare bed and taped a hand-drawn, "Welcome, Eric's," sign to the door. She lingered there as though the word "welcome" was an artifact she had only seen in museums. "Is this appropriate?" she asked, not of the sign but of the bed, the light, the way our lives suddenly shared space. "It's yours," I said. "You can do anything you want with it." She frowned in concentration until the bioluminescent lines smoothed. "Anything," she repeated, and the way she said it made me realize that where she came from, anything was not a common gift. University orientation for off-worlders had given her a handbook heavy with diagrams. How to ride buses, what to do in a fire, why you mustn't stare at police drones, what allergies might strike, how to understand an earth lease without selling your kidneys. But guides never described the sound of old pipes or the way a city teaches you to walk in tight S-curves to avoid puddles that look shallow and aren't. So I showed her the ancient radiator you had to kick twice to make it behave. I explained what a roommate chore wheel was and how garbage night had a rhythm like a tide. We tried to cook together and realized that our shared nouns hid different flavors. When I said salt, I meant something to bring things into focus, but when she said salt, she meant the flakes of ocean memory harvested on her world's moon, more ritual than seasoning. The first time she tasted earth basil, she started crying quietly, saying it tasted like a story her mother told about a river that used to flow uphill back home. I apologized for the basil as though it were a prank. She apologized for the tears as though they were pollution. That was how we began, clumsy, sincere, standing on the edges of each other's maps and drawing the bridges as we crossed. Classes took her until late afternoon. She studied xenobiology and comparative cognition, fields that, in the stories, usually involve someone saving a planet. In reality, it meant long hours in cold labs measuring the ways neuron clusters responded to different rhythms, and long nights at our chipped kitchen table drinking peppermint tea while she murmured through new vocabulary. I learned that on her world, family names are not inherited so much as earned, each syllable a deed. I learned that she had earned her right to carry the signifier vel when she rebuilt an aquatic filter system after a storm and saved 3 villages from a bloom that would have poisoned their water for a decade. "But that is not special," she claimed, and then laughed when I told her it was to me. "You grew your own basil," she said, "on a windowsill, with air that moves and smoke from buses and heat that forgets to heat. You built life in a place that tries to be indifferent to you. That is the kind of bravery that thrills my tutors." When she spoke like that, the walls felt like they listened, and even the radiators seemed to hum in tune. The neighbors on Orion Street learned about Eric's in the way cities learn. A ripple of curiosity turned to acceptance, turned to the new baseline. Mrs. Alvarez on the 3rd floor sent over a pot of arroz con pollo and a handwritten note that said, "Welcome to the building. Your light is pretty." The teenager across the hall, who had a penchant for skateboard tricks and scuffed knees, asked in his most casual voice whether off-worlders could do flips in low gravity, and then tried not to care when she said, "Yes, but not here, and I am sorry." People noticed that our window glowed faintly when she laughed, that she rotated the small apartment plants to face not the sun, but a slightly different frequency, that she stood in the rain with her face tilted up and whispered to it in a tongue that sounded like wind chimes trying to remember a song. No one said alien as a noun around her. They said Orcs as a fact, the way you might say autumn or library, something that happens in the world and is not negotiable. At night, when the city exhausted itself to a murmur, we told each other stories. She told me about tides on her planet whose fingernails scraped the sky, leaving trails that mariners read as proverbs. I told her about childhood summers with cousins, dust and bike chains, the smell of gasoline, and the way the sky looked through the slats of the garage door like a secret you were allowed to keep. Sometimes we fell asleep mid-sentence on opposite ends of the couch, feet almost touching, the kind of domestic accident that feels like a hymn. It was ordinary, that's the truth. Ordinary and soft, and filled with those small, deliberate acts by which strangers choose to become each other's safety. And in that ordinariness, something began to take shape and attention, a warmth, not the sudden fire of stories but the steady ember that survives unglamorous winds. At the time, I called it friendship. Even later, when language tried to run ahead of us, friendship remained the first word, the quiet word that made the rest possible. Chapter 2. The Study of Hearts and Other Weather. The change began in the lab, or rather in the way Orcs walked home from it. There are some days when science is a lit candle in a dark room, and others when it is a door that refuses to unlock no matter how politely you address it. She had spent weeks mapping cross-species empathy responses to patterns and sound. Lullabies, distress calls, celebration drumming. Those long, steady chords we build into movies to make our hearts lean forward. The trials showed what we already suspected. Beneath grammar and bone, living things tilt toward each other if you give them something to hold rhythm, resonance, a signal that says, "I'm here, and I'm paying attention." But the data wasn't aligning with the theory her advisor wanted to take to the conference in Geneva, and each misalignment became a sliver under her fingernail. That day she came home in the blue hour, shoulders drawn in, the faint glow at her temples muted to a dull pearl. I set tea in front of her and didn't ask questions because questions can sometimes feel like accusations. She stared into the steam as if the rising curls could be translated into answers. "On my world," she said finally, "there is a word that means, the sky is heavy, but it will not rain here." My head feels like that. We took a walk because walks are the way humans unsnarl knots. Orion Street led us out toward the river. The air was dense with the smells of fried dough and engine oil, and the further we walked the more the city softened its elbows. She matched her steps to mine, and after a few blocks her glow regained its confidence, just a little. She asked me about the first time I had fallen in love, and I laughed in a way that meant I had to think about how love wants to be described. "I'm not sure I have a first time," I said, after the traffic paused and gave us permission to cross with the light. It felt like turning toward a sound I couldn't quite hear, like noticing my own breath in winter. She considered that, then nodded. "We have a ritual," she said. "It is not what your films would call romantic. It is practical and quiet. Two people who believe they could knit a life together choose an afternoon when the tide is steady. They carry plain bread and water. They walk to the edge of the shallows and share the bread. Then they stand ankle deep until the water runs around their feet, and both of them say something true that scares them. If the truths make room for each other, they begin. If not, they bow. It is not binding, only an agreement to practice listening." I asked her what truths she thought she might say if she ever did the ritual here, on a foreign planet, with the river making its own opinion known below the bridge. She said she would say that she pretends to be braver than she feels because the fellowship requires bravery as part of its bargain. She would say that sometimes she fears that learning to speak human languages will mean forgetting how her own tongue sings. I said I might admit that I am embarrassed by how often I want to be forgiven by people who are not angry with me, that I'm worried I am merely collecting kindnesses like trinkets instead of learning how to be one. The river made a sound like it wanted to be included, and we both turned to look at it, the long seam of water catching streetlights and rebraiding them into gold rope. Weeks went by and our life became articulate. We learned each other's rituals. She left small bowls of water on the windowsill on the first day of every week, not as offerings, but as reminders that life gathers in small hollows. I started making breakfast at the same time she woke, so that the scent of toast and coffee would pull the edges of morning together around her. We invented games to play during power outages, naming constellations we could not see, making secret lists of words that felt like doorways. One night, across the hush of shared candlelight, she said, "I am studying the ways beings connect, and yet I realize I do not understand how your people name the moment between friend and family. It seems to contain the shape of both." I told her about the English language's clumsy bravery. I told her how we take words and make them do double shifts, how home can be a place or a person, how together can be a geography, even across the ocean. She pressed her palm to the tabletop, like she was reading the grain of the wood. "We have a word," she said softly, and she told me a sound I couldn't reproduce, a chord more than a syllable. "It means, we are not one creature, but our shadows have agreed to travel side by side." That is the space I think we are in. The first misunderstanding of consequence came sooner than I'd like to admit. I had been offered a small freelance job repairing an antique synthesizer for a musician who lived 3 stops down the train line. It meant early mornings in his studio, evenings of testing, and hours when the apartment sat empty except for the ghosts of heat. Eric's had been deep in her data sets, chasing a stubborn outlier, and I assumed that my absence would be a relief. Instead, the night I came home late, she was there on the couch with her hands folded in perfect stillness, the kind of posture one assumes during rites. "Did I err?" she asked before I could set my keys in the dish. "I made the meal that seems to comfort you most, but I let it cool, thinking you would not want it too hot. Have I chosen incorrectly?" The table held careful plates of pasta with basil, chicken seasoned with an earth spice blend she had decided she trusted, a bowl of salad dressed in the precise ratio of lemon to oil we had discovered over experiments. I realized then that in her culture, not telling someone why the hearth would be empty was an absence that had a language of its own. We sat. We ate. We translated. "When I am gone," I told her, "it means I have gone to earn the coins that keep the radiator humming. It means I have gone to be useful, but not more useful than here. If the food cools, it will still be food, and I will still thank you." She nodded. "When you are gone," she said in return, "I will not think you are building a different home. I will keep the light at the window tuned to the frequency that means safe return." She began to ask sharper questions about humans, not the broad curious kind, but the ones we ask when we intend to stake our real lives on the answers. How do you know when you are wanted without being asked for? What does it mean when someone says, "Take care"? As a farewell, what are you meant to take, and why must you carry it alone? How do you avoid mistaking someone's fear of being alone for their love of you? The handbook had a chapter on cross-cultural affectional practices, but it focused on safe hugs and the appropriate distance at bus stops. It did not explain why my stomach lifted when I found her note on the refrigerator that read, "We are out of basil, but not out of courage." It did not explain why she began to keep her textbooks in the kitchen instead of her room, why she started falling asleep at the table while I worked, head pillowed on her arms, trusting me to be there when she woke. It did not, could not, tell either of us when our shadows agreed to travel side by side. Chapter 3, The Compatibility Ritual. The university announced a cultural exchange evening, a gallery space transformed into a market of customs, music, smells, the carefully shared pieces of 100 worlds. Eric's was tasked with demonstrating a traditional Velian compatibility ritual, strictly non-binding, strictly educational, the kind of thing meant to entertain donors and remind bureaucrats why budgets matter. It is not about coupling, she clarified, careful with the word. It is about learning whether our skins know how to stand near each other without bristling. She needed a volunteer for the demonstration, someone from Earth who could be trusted to be gentle with a ceremony they did not own. I teased that she must have a list. She looked at me with that steady gaze of hers that made my jokes fall quiet. "There is only one human I would trust to teach this with me in a room of cameras," she said. And in that instant I understood how solemn an invitation can be even when it arrives disguised as a favor. The gallery hummed with the electricity of many languages. A stall to our left offered dumplings whose steam rose like miniature weather systems. To our right, A trio of musicians played stringed instruments that looked like bridges waiting for rivers. A banner above our table read, "In 24 alphabets, learning to listen, the Velian practice of proximity harmonization." Eric's had arranged the elements with care. 2 plain clay cups, a bowl of water, a loaf of bread so simple even the gluten-averse donors could not object, and a small, palm-sized orb that contained within it a sliver of the sea from her world, a gift transported across the dark. She wore the formal cloth from her house, the color of rain as it approaches, and the glow at her temples was clear and certain, like a lighthouse speaking across fog. She explained the practice to the audience. 2 people, not bound by anything except attention, step into a small circle. They share water and bread, not to signal ownership, but to acknowledge that sustenance is a shared project. Then they stand closer than acquaintances, but not intimate, and are quiet together for the length of a song. During the silence, the Velian orb listens to both bodies, measuring pulse, temperature changes, microtremors, and a dozen other subtle rhythms. It is not magic. It is biology paying attention to its own frequencies. At the end, the orb produces a pattern of light that reflects how well the 2 bodies calmed each other's storms. A strong pattern means the pair could build a life without grinding each other into sand. A weak pattern suggests they would need to negotiate more carefully. It's not destiny. She emphasized to the camera, hungry for romance. It is a mirror you can use or ignore. We prefer to know where we begin. We began. I stepped into the circle. The gallery fell into a silence that had weight to it, the way silence does when something matters. The water tasted like the word necessary. The bread was soft, the kind of softness that comes from patience rather than sugar. When we stood very near each other in the center and allowed ourselves to breathe, I realized how rarely we let our bodies learn someone without the noise of words. I could feel the heat stored in her sleeves from the lights. I could see the micro-patterns of the glow along her temples as her heart slowed to meet mine somewhere between the drumbeat of a city and the steadier thrum of a sea that had never seen Earth. The orb brightened gradually, as if remembering how, and then it bloomed, a clean, round tapestry of interlaced lines, the sort of signal that the diagrams labeled harmonics favorable for cohabitation, cooperative projects, and long journeys. There was polite applause, the murmurs one hears when donors decide to add a 0 to a check, but that was far out at the edges of my awareness, somewhere past the table with dumplings and the trio with their bridge instruments. In the center of the circle, we were both looking down at our hands, which had found each other in the way hands do when the rest of you is too shy to go first. Eric's lifted her gaze and met mine, and in that instant the distance between the words we had and the ones we needed narrowed to a path we could walk. Our shadows, she whispered, seemed to have agreed. After the demonstration, we retreated into the corridor that smelled faintly of paint and the lobby's dying ficus. The orb had dimmed to its travel sleep. We laughed, and then didn't. Words returned haltingly, as if shy to interrupt. "It is a mirror you can use or ignore," I said, an echo of her own cautions. "We should not let a tool tell us how to name each other." She nodded, but her eyes were bright with something that was not just scientific interest. "Of course," she said. "We should listen instead to basil and radiators, to tea steam and shared notes on refrigerators." She reached up then, and, with the gentlest touch, placed her fingertips at the line of my jaw, a gesture I had seen her use once to calm a trembling animal in a park. My body answered in a vocabulary older than my education. It relaxed, like a cord resolving. "We are not one creature," she said, voice low, "but perhaps we are a home." We did not rush. That was the first promise we made to ourselves. We would translate slowly. We would not pretend that desire isn't a language, but we would learn to conjugate it into kindness before we try to speak it in any other tense. The university's handbook had a section on responsible relationships that read like a contract, and we decided we needed something more like a song. We wrote a list on the back of an old assignment. "We will say what is true even if it is unbeautiful. We will not keep score. We will ask before we assume touch is wanted. We will care for the other as they define care. We will let the other care for us. We will not borrow a future from a present that is still learning our names." We sign not with signatures, but with the imprint of our thumbs in a patch of flour left on the counter from baking bread that morning. It was ridiculous. It was ours. The first time we tried to cook together after the ritual, every object in the kitchen seemed to want to participate. The kettle whistled too eagerly. The cutting board slid with the conspiracy of old wood. The basil preened. The radiator hissed in the key of E. We made a mess. We scrubbed it up laughing. We moved carefully in the small space, learning the choreography of being near without crowding, finding those small magics that, in certain lights, already looked like vows. The way she handed me a towel, without comment when the pot boiled over. The way I adjusted the window just enough to let out the steam, without scolding the cold back in. When we finally sat down, the food tasted like a bridge that had remembered its river. I wish my tutors could measure this, she said, gesturing not at the plates but at the distance between them, a distance that had begun to feel like a place. Chapter 4. The Shape of We. The hardest part of love, once you admit that's what you're doing, is defending it against the petty violences of the calendar. Rent is due. Deadlines do not respect tenderness. The city decides to shut off water for 12 hours to repair a main that has never forgiven being asked to serve a neighborhood it doesn't like. The fellowship wants polished results while the experiment insists on being stubborn. The musician texts that the synthesizer makes a ghost note when you press two keys too near each other. You run out of basil. The radiator sulks. You are both tired in different alphabets. None of these are tragedies. Together, they can trick you into believing that the miracle is only a matter of logistics. So you fight for the shape of your days. We made small rituals sturdier. Tuesday nights were for long, slow cooking with whatever the market offered. Friday mornings were for walking to the river and saying truths that scared us. We never made rules against devices at dinner. We instead made dinner interesting enough that we forgot to pick them up. There were mistakes, of course. The first time I called her my girlfriend to a casual friend in a text, the word felt like trying to fit a cathedral inside a shoebox. The second time, Eric's tried to translate that word into her language and accidentally named me something closer to advised co-captain with rights of last word in emergencies, which was, to be fair, a job description I could admire, but not exactly the mood I was going for. We learned to let labels be toolboxes rather than cages, to choose the tool that suited the day. On an afternoon spent repairing a bookshelf that had leaned since the year of its birth, we were co-engineers. During a night of fever when the city pressed its heat into the apartment like a punishment, we were patient and nurse, water bearer and window adjuster. On mornings when the light was so tender it made us speak softly, we were simply we. One evening, after the lab had finally produced a set of data that the advisor declared presentable if not yet perfect, we celebrated by taking the train north to a small museum that specialized in fragile things. Pressed flowers removed from long-demolished houses. Handwritten recipes recovered from near-forgotten cookbooks. A display of folded paper cranes from a school that no longer stood. We wandered with the reverence of thieves who had chosen not to steal. In a quiet room that smelled faintly of dust and lime, there was a case with a cracked ceramic cup. The placard explained that the cup had traveled across an ocean in the pocket of someone's coat, survived storms and luck, and broken not during the journey but years later, when a child knocked it off a table while reaching for a bowl of fruit. The owner had mended the cup with visible gold, the old technique of honoring the wound. "This is the most human thing I have seen," Eric's murmured, leaning close. "You do not pretend it was never broken." I thought of our list on the back of that old assignment. I thought of how we had already learned to mend small cracks with words and tea and being quiet in the right places. "We could be like that," I said, not meaning we should aim to break, but that we could be honest about the repairs when they were necessary. She nodded. "Our shadows," she said, "would agree." There was a night when the city went dark in a way that felt personal. A transformer failed, and the neighborhood fell into a darkness that once would have been ordinary, but now felt like a protest. We lit the candles, the good kind that knew how to keep their wicks dignified. The windows admitted a cool breeze that tried to be polite about the smell of the dumpsters. Somewhere 2 blocks over, someone played a trumpet, badly and beautifully. We lay on the floor like children at a sleepover, and Eric's told me a story from her earliest years, about the time she got lost in a market and found her way home by following the sound of women singing at their work. I told her about the time my mother broke down at a hairpin curve on a mountain road, and a stranger in a truck stopped, fixed what he could, then drove slowly in front of us all the way down so we could borrow his brake lights as a promise of where to place our fear. Humans, she said with a smile against the ceiling, are very good at lighting each other. It was a line I carried forward to every crowded day. It was a truth to say on Friday mornings when we were ankle-deep in river and confessing our brave unbeautifuls. When the university finally held the conference in Geneva, Eric's work was presented by a panel because the fellowship wanted to highlight the team. This suited her humility and annoyed me on principle. I wanted the room to feel what I felt when she turned to a problem with her whole attention, the moral force of a mind asking to be useful. We watched the live stream together, pausing to make tea, unpausing to hear how people named what they could not quite describe. The part that mattered most to me was not the praise they gave or the small questions about methods. It was the moment when someone asked whether her compatibility ritual had any analog on Earth that could be studied in controlled settings, and one of the panelists said, almost as an aside, "We have many such rituals. We just forgot to call them rituals." Shared meals. Holding hands in the waiting room. Two neighbors who walked the same block every evening with coffee and let the city check their pulse. I felt seen in a way that was both particular and universal. Our kitchen, our radiator, our basil, our river, held up as examples of a science that moves only at the speed of trust. We made no dramatic declarations. We did not need to. The world kept doing what the world does. It offered rains to windows, bills to mailboxes, small mercies to hurry. On a Tuesday, we repotted the basil. On a Friday, we said truths that scared us. She said she sometimes feared that if she stayed on Earth long enough, she would begin to think in ways that would make her a stranger to the currents of her birth. I said I sometimes feared that wanting to be good would distract me from actually being so. On a Sunday, Mrs. Alvarez taught us to make the arroz con pollo properly, and we laughed at our past attempts. On a Thursday, the teenager across the hall landed a skateboard trick in the lobby, and we cheered like he had won the Nobel. On a cold morning in winter, we learned that two bodies can share heat under one wool blanket, and that sharing heat is not a euphemism, but a practical kindness. On a soft night in spring, we translated the word home into a dozen synonyms and decided none were adequate, so we made dinner instead. Ending. How to carry a river. If there is a lesson here, it is not that compatibility is a light you either have or don't. It is that two lives can be tuned, gently and without violence, until their frequencies stop interfering and begin to compose. The compatibility ritual, the orb, the donors with their gentle applause, those are tools. The real work happened at the kitchen table in a room with scuffed paint, where a human who had learned to coax old machines into working and an off-worlder who had earned a name by saving a river filtered each other's days through patience. The real work was not fireworks or destiny. It was the decision, renewed daily, to be a place the other could safely be ordinary. We still keep bowls of water on the windowsill. We still walk to the river on Fridays and stand ankle-deep in the truth. We do not ask miracles from each other. We ask for basil, and to be told if the radiator has begun to sulk again, and for the courtesy of a note when the day will keep us out later than expected. This morning, she left a message on the refrigerator. I am practicing the part of your language where take care does not mean take it away alone. Let us carry it together. It made me laugh, the way a good sentence can undo tension like a knot you were sure was permanent. I replied with my own note. Our shadows have agreed to travel side by side. The rest is logistics and tea. In the end, love, as we learned it, is a practice of weather. Some days the sky is heavy and it rains. Some days it refuses. Some days the light catches the telephone wires in a way that makes even the smog look like an intentional filter from a documentary on tenderness. We have become an encyclopedia of each other's forecasts, a pantry of remedies, a map of hiding places and shortcuts, a prayer where neither of us is asked to be a miracle worker and both of us are allowed to be a person. If you asked me to show you proof, I would lead you not to the orb with its beautiful harmonics, but to our sink at dusk, to 2 cups drying in a rack, to a loaf of bread slowly disappearing between us over an ordinary week, to the shape of 2 shadows on Orion Street that keep time together when the wind rises, that do not merge no need but that refuse to lose each other when the city tests its storms. And if you asked me for a ritual you could practice, I would tell you this: share water and bread. Stand near with your full attention. Let your silences be long enough for your heartbeat to learn the other's name. Say what is true even if it scares you. Light each other when the transformer fails. Leave a note on the refrigerator that says how to carry the river today. And when the basil goes to seed, plant it again with the same foolish hope that keeps this planet turning toward its sun.